All right, welcome everyone. So we're back to the next episode of the Carbon to Metal Coating Institute, the EDII Catalyst podcast. For any new listeners tuning in, I'm your host, Dr. Emily Albright, and in this podcast series, we will explore topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, indigenization, and STEM, featuring guest speakers from diverse backgrounds and perspectives discussing their lived experiences, as well as providing some tips and resources on how to create more inclusive and equitable research environments. Through this, we hope to inspire you to be a catalyst for change in your own communities and workplaces. A few quick notes before we get started. After the live session, the podcast video will be shared on our YouTube channel. If you prefer to remain anonymous, please remain muted and off camera. There will be time at the end of the session for members to ask questions, so please remain muted until then, and you can put any comments or questions in the chat as we go along as well, and we'll review those at the end. All right, so today I'm really excited to have C2MCI's scientific director and my previous PhD supervisor, Dr. Cathleen Crudden, join us for the discussion today on allyship. So welcome, Kathy. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here. I usually watch these or lurk, so it's a little different experience for me, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you on here. So, as always, I always give a brief introduction, but it's always better to hear about your experiences from you. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey in STEM, how you got to where you are today? I know that's a loaded question sometimes.
Yeah, that's a big question, but thank you. Yeah, so I was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, so I'm an immigrant to Canada. I was brought here, so I by my parents. Although being a white person, people don't often see that as an, I'm not seen as an immigrant. Um, and I grew up in Toronto, I know this is one of your questions you normally ask. I started loving chemistry with my high school chemistry teacher. So I really respect the work that high school teachers do because they're so important at a key time. And then I did my undergraduate and my master's at University of Toronto, PhD in Ottawa. During that time, I had the pleasure of going to Japan for 3 months, and that was really life-changing for me. Postdoc, and then I started in the States, and then I started at UNB and moved to Queens after that.
Yeah, I'm same. In high school, I actually didn't love chemistry at that point. I liked it, but I actually thought I would be more into physics, which I'm so glad I did not go down that route. Once I got into university, I knew that wasn't the thing. But one of the big things for me was the fact that all of my science teachers in high school were all women, which I think is pretty amazing. And I think one of the big things that helped me know that I could pursue science as a potential career down the road.
That's a great point, Emily. And actually, I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, so all the people in power were women. We had some male teachers, but the ones who held all the power were the nuns. And they didn't wear full habit; they just wore a cross, so they didn't come across as overly religious. And they were just many of them were real powerhouses, so that was pretty amazing. And then I went to university, and all my profs were men, so that was a bit weird. Although I took some English classes and then I saw, well, wow, women can be professors. So it was really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So thanks for sharing a little bit about that. So today's conversation is around allyship, and maybe
Hmm.
you can build more about some of your experiences here. So what does allyship mean to you in STEM? And yeah, what are some of your experiences?
Yeah, thanks. I've been thinking a lot about this since you asked me to be on this, and it's weird for me to feel like I'm in a position of power, but I'm the director of the institute. I'm a senior faculty member here at Queen's, and so I think that's fair to say that I am in positions of power. And it makes me realize even more um, how bad it is when people abuse that. We should be using whatever power we have to lift up those around us. And I try to do that. I don't always succeed. I make mistakes. I try to own those and apologize when I do make mistakes. But my intention is always to try to make things better for those who are, you know, in positions that are more junior to me.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
That's
it's complicated, right? It's not always easy to understand how to be an ally. I try to educate myself as much as possible. And you know, I think one of the key things that I've learned and that I try to do is to ask people, if they want me to intervene on their behalf because they don't always. And, and also to create that space where um you people are comfortable to speak freely is really important. But there have been a few occasions where, people have said, no, it's okay. I don't want you to intervene, or people have said, yes, please say something. So I think it's really important to ask, and because what you're trying to do is it's not about you, right? You're not trying to, and this is important, especially as, I'm a woman in STEM, so I'm an underrepresented group there, but I'm a white person, and so that's an overrepresented group. And so when you're coming from an overrepresented group, it's not about you, it's not about making you look better. It should be about making the system better and supporting those who need it.
right. Yeah. And I think that's come up recently too, of where, because I feel the same way. I'm also a woman in STEM. So at some extent, I am underrepresented, but I would say my experience was not that. I felt very supportive with lots of women in STEM and lots of people throughout my journey. But I know, and I'll get back to this note about representation. A lot of people have noted previously that seeing people like them in their field is really important. But then I think allyship comes into in the sense of if there isn't people who look like you in an institution, so for example, like us who may be women, but we are still white, so we have a lot of privilege, then helping support those people and being voices for them, or so that they know that they can have a voice. And I think that's kind of building on what you were saying there. Yeah, so can you talk about any times that where you had someone that you felt was an ally for you as a woman in STEM?
Yeah, so that was a great question. That and for everybody here, Emily is kind enough to send a couple of questions in advance for us to think about. And I had to give that one some thought. I mean, I'm sure I have had allies, right? I'm old enough to have been in a situation where I'm the only woman in a lab. As a postdoc, I was the only woman for a large part of the time. And in Japan, I was the only woman, the only non-Japanese in the entire department while I was there. Um, but openly, I think probably the one case when I was openly it was very obvious that somebody was being an ally towards me was when I was on the organizing committee for Pacific Chem. So this is one of the biggest chemistry conferences in the world, and it's held in Hawaii. And I was there's only two Canadians, and then at some point when we were organizing, three Canadians on the team. And so it's a position of honor for sure. Many people see that as, you're a leader in the field in your country when you're selected for that. But I was sitting at the conference and I was just talking with some profs and a few people from industry and others, and said that I was on the organizing committee. And one of the guys there said, oh, I submitted my abstract and I haven't heard back. Could you check on that? And also I'm having problems with my housing. And I said, listen, like I'm not that
Mm.
kind of organizer. I'm the scientific organizer. And he just could not wrap it around his head that I was a faculty member and not, an assistant of some type, right? And I think you get this a lot as a woman, people undervaluing the roles of, people in these kind of administrative assistant roles, and then not understanding that you can be a faculty member. And Matt Sigmund was actually there. I don't know if people know him. He's a big name in catalysis. And he said, dude, she's on the organizing committee. She's a prof. And the guy just could not, like it was multiple times. And then Sigmund and I wrote him this yesterday when I was thinking about it to thank him and tell him he didn't even remember doing this. And he said, she's the bomb. I remember saying that. He's like, she's a big deal, dude. Come on, get your head around. Like, but it took multiple tries. So that was really interesting, and interesting that he didn't even remember this. So,
Yeah.
it's really appreciated, because when you're trying to stand up for yourself in a role like this, in a situation like that, so it's hard because you're not wanting to say, hey, I'm a big deal. It's so
Yeah.
really helpful for other people to jump in.
Yeah, I have a similar situation where I always felt same thing. As I just mentioned, I felt like I had a lot of privilege in my science career, and it actually wasn't until my PhD where I was working on with a team, collaborating with people in physics, and we were doing a project, and it was to do with our work, so nanoclusters. So I technically had the most experience in that because I was working with a team of physicists. They know the physics side, but they didn't know the specific details. So sometimes when we were designing that project, I would try to make suggestions about what we should do and why and explaining. And sometimes I felt like I was just getting kind of like pushed aside or just like, yeah, yeah, okay, and then like whatever. But then they would ask one of the other members the same question, who's a male, and then he would be okay with the idea. And then, but it was real, what happened for me, where I had an ally was one of the members, he would then be like, no, 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 that was what Emily was suggesting, and I agree with her. And it's a very subtle thing, but it can be very impactful for the person who's experiencing it.
Yeah.
I've considered myself fortunate that I haven't been in many situations where I've needed it, but it does still happen today. And it's one of those things that it's important to be supportive of your peers. And if someone has an idea and you agree with them, even that little thing of just speaking up and supporting those people can be a big deal to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Actually, after the pandemic, when I went to my first lecture in a new field, in an area that I wasn't well known in, you get all you get to see all the sexism again, right? The people talking to the men that I was with, not to me, and not understanding that maybe I was a speaker. But it's interesting that you raise physics. There's an interesting article recently about the hierarchies in science and how these are basically related to the amount of math that's done and the amount of men in them. And so
Interesting.
it's physics is better than chemistry, math is better than physics, this kind of thing. And it's it's just another form of discrimination.
Yep, yep, totally agree. So maybe following up with this question too, was there situations where you felt like you were an ally or someone indicated to you that you were an ally? Because usually too with allyship, you don't usually say, I'm an ally.
Yeah.
Usually there's a certain situation where
Yeah,
you
there've been a couple, um, and a couple involving people on this call, which I will not call out, but um, it's hard, sometimes you have a person in a position of power that's making a judgment or saying something, and it's well, I first started with one of these situations where I went to the person who I thought was badly treated and said, "Oh, I'm sorry that that happened to you," but I felt like that's like the entry level, and then I thought, okay, no, and I wrote to the person who was a senior male prof at the time and said, "Hey, buddy, that was not okay what you did." And to this guy's credit, he hadn't understood this. This was about asking someone to smile more. It's just like it's not your business how somebody is looking. Maybe they're having a hard day. They should be allowed to have a hard day. Um, and so there was that, and there was another case where the really prominent female scientist, and we were on these calls with politicians, and one of our team, who's a guy, was constantly interrupting her, and it was getting to the point where it was just tiresome. And I wrote to her and I said, I feel like this guy is always interrupting you. Would you like me to say something? And she wrote and she said yes. And so I wrote him an email and I said, somebody's speaking in a situation like this, there's interrupting, but there's also like putting your hand up, like, oh, hey, 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 look at me, and asking for, um, even a virtual hand, and just really you're distracting from what the person is saying. And a good friend of mine, Rachel Burks, who's amazing. If you guys don't follow her, don't know her, it's really great to do so. She teaches me a lot. She told me sent me an interesting article on, how why people converse, right? Is it about creating actually a conversation or a linkage, or is it about controlling the situation and being seen as the one in power? And how that's part of the, what's happening when people are interrupting. But yeah, so I was happy to step in, and it got better after that.
Yeah, it's nice that you mentioned Rachel Burks. We actually are going to have her on the podcast in January, so good plug for future ones to come.
Yay.
Um, so yeah, I think for me, I don't know if I'm not thinking of specific situations of where I've been an ally, but I think we can think of being an ally in a broad sense too. So there's a situation because you might not always be in the situation where you have a direct, like a one-on-one with a person and you're seeing something happening to them, but you can also be an ally in the sense of supporting the different EDI work, learning, and educating yourself as well.
Yeah.
So are there
Yeah.
any some suggestions that you have for people in STEM to be an effective ally? Or what are some things that you've incorporated into what you do to make sure that you're being supportive of members and equity deserving groups?
Yeah, I mean, most of my experience is centered around the male-female thing. Um, so I don't want to pretend that I have any idea what it's like to be, in more than one group, although I've done the more than one underrepresented group, although I've seen that it's just, and I've done the reading as much as I can, not nearly enough, but um, you know, the data show that as you add more than one underrepresentation group into a single individual, the discrimination just gets worse and worse. And so it's something that I try to be aware of. I spent a lot of time in Japan, as you all know, and when you look at somebody who's a female scientist, a woman scientist, and Asian, there is this expectation of service and the expectations of behavior are even more extreme. And I think that's something we need to push back on. I've had people say to me, so and so is not, comes across, as more aggressive or whatever. And this happens all the time with women, and even more with women who are also people of color. And I refuse to take it. I'm like, I'm sorry, you need to adjust your expectations. Um, and that's what I tell people. I see this as, as racism. Women should be quieter, women should, this kind of thing. And as I say, my experience observing this, not feeling it, is that it's even worse when the person is a person of color. And so I think we need to constantly push back on that, and also ask ourselves when our expectations of behavior, how are they transmitting? And then, do the work of understanding your own biases. We all have biases, and just try to do better. I remember my PhD supervisor way back in ancient history. We were all in a room when um, he was giving a presentation about reaching out to government, and he said, you should reach out to your member of parliament and tell her about the importance of science. And the whole room just was like, because he didn't make the assumption. And again, this was in the 90s, right? Ancient history. He didn't make the assumption that your MP was going to be a man. And he specifically said, he said he was so tired of everybody assuming it was that it was men in these positions of power. So he made the assumption as a woman. And it was just really powerful. And, however many decades later, I still remember it. So little things like that can be really impactful, and pushing yourself on not making assumptions like that.
Yep, I agree. I think trying to avoid assumptions about other people as well is also important when you're trying to be an ally, because you have to, I think this comes into like the intercultural awareness, if you've ever had
Yeah.
any of that kind of training. It's it's about yourself understanding where you're coming from and being able to reflect on, okay, why did I react this way? And then that
Yeah.
can also help you then understand why somebody else might be reacting a certain way. And I think if you start to learn that and have that understanding, you become more aware of situations, and then you can know how to react in those situations as well.
Yeah, and I think it's extremely important to be constantly trying to do better, to make an environment where people feel like they can be themselves, right? You look at groups that are historically and continue to be marginalized and treated badly, and people can be members of a an underrepresented or a group that's been severely discriminated against, and not want to talk about it. And then they spend their work lives sort of trying to hide who they are. And I think it's really important to, not have to deal with that stress, and just be able to be yourself. I had a conversation with an older Japanese colleague about LGBTQ people, and Japan is not overly accepting of this, or not don't have good understanding. And he said to me that he had never had a student in his lab who was part of the LGBTQ community. And I just ran the numbers for him. I said, you've been a prof for 25 years. You've had 20 students in your group every year. Do you really, now they don't all turn over, right? But do you really think you haven't had a single student who's anything other than heterosexual in that time? Or do you think they weren't comfortable with you and the situation to tell you that and to be their true selves. And he at least, understood the numbers, and he realized that, yeah, that's a problem. So yeah, so I think that's interesting to consider, that there's lots of um there's lots of layers to this.
Yep, I agree. And I think we at our seminar that we had last week, Dr. Trisha Carmichael mentioned just simply putting a sticker saying that her office was a positive space. It seems like such a small thing, but it can be a big deal for somebody who might be in these underrepresented groups looking for a community, looking for a safe space to talk about things that they're going through.
Yeah, agree. And I see Paul's rainbow there, which is awesome. And I always try, I like these little Dana from our groups made up some, or helped us get some really cool stickers. And I always try to put this on my slides as well. And so, just I agree with you. It's just it's a way of saying, that you try and that you care. And I've struggled. I know we should get into questions for soon, but I've also
Mhm.
struggled with how to deal with recognizing Canada's, all the horrible things that we've done to Indigenous children and Indigenous community. And, the land citations or the land acknowledgements is one thing, but I find I have a hard time doing a good job of those. So I've decided recently, I found a map of North America that has all of the original Indigenous um, uh, areas, Anishinaabe, etc. And I use that as my map now instead, and I put Kingston there. And I was at Harvard recently, and they're having a lot of pushback. People don't want EDI kind of discussions. And he was one of the guys I was talking to, was the head of it for Harvard chemistry. And he asked me, what should I do? And so we had a good conversation. And I said, what did you think about my map? I felt it was more subtle than the land acknowledgement. And he said, yeah, it wasn't subtle. No, but good. So that's good. I mean, again, I'm like trying to take feedback from people who actually live that experience, but yeah, just trying to do my best.
Yeah. And I think with that too is you need to avoid the like making it just checking a box, right? Oh, I'm being told we need to do land acknowledgements, let's just do
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Versus someone who actually does a meaningful one. So
yeah,
even your example of adding a map and making it more personal is then more meaningful and more impactful, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we are getting close to time for audience questions. So I'll flag the audience. Maybe you can start thinking of your questions or putting them in the chat. And maybe while you're doing that, we'll ask the final, would your big key message or takeaway that you would like everyone to leave with today about allyship?
Yeah, I guess for me, I've always been someone who's interested in social justice, and I don't like the situation that um, I don't like unfairness. So I get really makes me angry. So that kind of, I think that's what drives me in this. And I want, my students and the people that I work with at the Institute to feel that they have the best supports that we can give them. And that's always not always perfect. Like I said, I make mistakes. But please call me on it. If I do something that I could do better on, I really, really appreciate it when people say, hey, I would prefer this, or please, consider that. I think that it's really I'm a lifelong learner, so it's a learning experience for me. And I want to do my best, right? You don't get in this role unless you're a high achiever. So I want to do my best at everything. So please come and talk to me or drop me a note or whatever, if you feel like there's something more we can do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's one of the nice things that we've done at the Institute is that we are supportive of these EDI initiatives. We have a committee to meet and discuss these things regularly. Things like this podcast to keep these conversations going, I think is really important in moving forward.
Thanks, Emily.
Okay, so we'll open it up to some audience questions or comments. You don't have to ask a question if you want to share anything about your experiences with allyship. Let's see here. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat and I can read the question.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Well, while other people are thinking of their questions, I have one more that I was wondering about. Is you're in a role as also an editor of one of your journals. Has there been situations where you've been in a place to support underrepresented groups in that
Yes, great question. So one of the first things I did was try to make our editorial team more reflective of the population. So that's an easy thing to do. But one of the big things we do is we try to deal with reviews that contain bias. Like I said, everything has bias. But when it gets extreme, it's too much. And this happens frequently with new authors, with younger corresponding authors, with women, probably as well with people of color, although that's harder to look at. But we've had the situation where people will, you get a review and it's like this kind of finger shaking thing, right? These young people today should know more about the literature, blah, 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 blah. We had a review where it was really critiquing the author, that these authors were not intelligent, like critiquing their intelligence and, multiple, like 20 points with repeated, like, why do you not know this? And we've made it a policy that we don't accept reviews like that. So what we do, my editors will come to me and say, what do I do? Do I delete this part of the review? And I don't like that. I don't think it's ethical to change a review. And sometimes they contain good comments, but there's all this garbage in them. So what we do is I, as the senior editor, I send it back because I know who the reviewer is, right? I send it back to the reviewer and I say, these particular comments are really not appropriate. Can we please edit them out? Because I feel like it's an education. And sometimes people will read them and go, oh yeah, wow, I never saw that. So but yes, and so it's a learning experience, and it also tells them that behavior is not acceptable. And then I don't want my authors to have to face that. Getting a negative review is hard enough, so we make it a comment that you critique the paper, not the author.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I know that's been a big topic for many years for people. It's always, oh, reviewer two, crazy.
Yeah,
But I think it can be very demotivating or
yeah,
critical to people to get negative comments about, like you said, more attacking the person
yeah.
rather than like the work.
That's right. And all of our editors have bias training that we have to do regularly, and that, to try to improve it among the editors. But the reviewers are harder to deal with. But then that's where the editor comes in. The editor sees the reviewer. And so there's definitely some accountability, right? And if reviewers are found to be really biased in their, then they won't get to comment, and then they don't get to shape the literature. So I think it's important that people get supported when they're um especially younger researchers, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, any other questions? I don't see questions or comments. We got a quiet audience today.
That's okay. I really appreciate everybody coming because I know how busy it is these days. And
Yes,
so thank
it
you for
is.
making the time to listen. And like I said, I'm always open to learning and you know, improving. I think that's important.
Yeah, so we'll end maybe with our last fun question, more of a sciencey question. So what is your favorite chemical element or molecule and why?
Ooh, that's hard. I should say carbene, but my favorite elements, I'll make it plural. I really like fluorine. It's such a crazy element, so hard to predict what it does. Think of it as really greedy. It's if it doesn't have enough electrons, it's crazy, but then if it does, it's really stable. So fluorine is pretty cool. Boron is another one, and boron and fluorine are really interesting partners, right? Very electronegative, very electropositive. Again, I like boron because you can do so much with it. And in the metal series, I've clearly thought too much about this. Rhodium. I love rhodium. I don't use rhodium anymore, but in catalysis, it's such an amazing element. It's expensive, but I always joke you get what you pay for. I told my husband we should name our daughter Rhoda in honor of rhodium, and I knew he would give me the thumbs down on that one, so that
That
didn't
would have been awesome.
yeah, awesome and awkward. But I don't there aren't many Rhodas around, so
Mhm.
but anyway, yeah, so those are my favorite elements.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kathy, for sharing with us today. And thank you everyone for listening. It is a busy time of the year, so we do appreciate everyone tuning in.
Yeah.
So we'll
Yeah,
see
thanks
you
everybody.
next month.
Thank you.